You never realize how well the grip on a shoe works until it stops you from closing a door. Hello humans, my name is Dael Kingsmill. We're talking about D&D today. People who follow me over on Twitter likely already know that I had one idea that I was working on for a D&D video, but I don't think it's ready yet. So instead, I asked Twitter what you all have been trying to kind of solve D&D wise, to try and get my, brain working. Clearly it still isn't. And the lovely Falconer mentioned that in an upcoming session, their party will be escorting about 100 refugees across the plains, and they didn't want it to become tedious or just like rolling through Oregon Trail. And this caught my attention, because I do have some ideas, and the beginning point of them is, would it being Oregon Trail be that bad? Hear me out, hear me out. Because it would be dope if we had some kind of a system in place that we could utilize for the sake of sort of sustained tests or endurance challenges. I haven't settled on the term I'm going to use for them. Now, of course, I've only been toying with this idea for a handful of days, so let's call it a prototype. If you want to spitball with me in the comments, add any ideas of your own that other people can sort of pluck from and build on top of, that'd be neat. Feel free to do that. So anyway, thinking of this idea of I wanted to implement some kind of a system that would be for specifically events where your party is kind of responsible for the welfare of a larger group over a long period of time. So, of course, the 100 refugees traveling to a safe place across the plains, but also situations like disaster relief, or even possibly, I think it could work for situations where your party is under siege and they're trying to keep a bunch of people safe, but specifically the kinds of sieges, more like the Rats of Tobruk, right? Where there's no hope of your side winning against the other army, you just have to hold out until someone can come and save you or get you out of there. So that's what I'm kind of doing here. The idea is for issues that are going to last probably a month at least in game time, and in which the focus is on your characters keeping other people safe or alive or what have you. So that's where escorting the 100 refugees, for example, would differ from something like overland travel. Overland travel, I did a video on a while back. You can check it out if you haven't seen it. But the idea there is that it focuses a little bit more on the minutiae, because it's your party looking after themselves mostly. So it gets a little bit more into the nitty-gritty, whereas when they're kind of looking after a large group of people, it becomes different because, if you've got 100 refugees, you don't really have much of an option for stealthy travel. You also are going to have a much harder time foraging effectively using the very simple methods discussed in overland travel. And we also assume that your party is competent at basic survival things like navigating in order to get these 100 refugees across the plains. So anyway, what were the things I wanted to include? I absolutely wanted to make sure that player engagement, it has to be active, not passive. I wanted it to be choices on choices, and I wanted those choices to build over time, to have that sensation of time moving. And without it necessarily being something that becomes tedious, still feeling that passage of time, still feeling like it is an endurance challenge. So anyway, an overall kind of idea of long-term engagements where hit points aren't so much the resource that you're worried about. There's a thing in survival in the real world called the rule of 3, which basically comes down to the idea that you can last 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. So basically that's the priority sequence. You might think it's important to go and find a source of water, but if you don't have shelter to keep you from the elements at night, then you're gonna die of exposure much faster than you will of thirst. Basically, that's the idea. So that's a useful jumping off point, but of course in D&D, we can assume that most of the time, trying to find air to breathe, it's a given. Let's just assume, for the sake of this, unless you're, doing an underwater bit, or in a sinking ship or something, which isn't particularly prolonged. That's not exactly a month-long engagement, let's be real. We can just skip over air and assume that that's fine. I wanted to take the emphasis off things like hit points and individual health so much and put it more onto resources like managing food, managing water, managing shelter, managing security for the group. And to a certain degree, perhaps replacing the idea of hit points with the idea of spirits. How high are the spirits of the people? Now, here's where you get, I just tore half this page off my book. Whoops, got too enthusiastic in that page turn, didn't I? Yes, I did. Oh dear. Here's where you're gonna have to stick with me a little bit again. I kind of thought it would be cool if, to emphasize that this is a prolonged thing that you're dealing with, it would be kind of cool if every session only covered like 1 week, say. So if this is a month-long thing that your party is handling in-game, every session is only going to cover 1 week of that thing. So it takes 4 different sessions to get through it. You might know what to do it that way, and it also might not work depending on how frequently your group meets or how long your sessions are. But work with me here. I think you'll see my side of it as at least not inherently horrendous once we're done. So I've got 3 different kinds of examples. Basically the ones that I mentioned earlier, sort of a prolonged siege, escorting the refugees, and disaster relief. Managing flood relief when a town has been flooded. The way that I envisage this, you come to your session prepared for 2 different eventualities. Basically, you describe a lot of travel, a lot of normal day-to-day stuff, some little things that happen. I don't know, basically just inform them of time traveling, do lots of description. I would even recommend writing out a full-on description and just reading it to your players if that's something you don't already do. Just to sort of emphasize that time and space have moved around you and your group. Well, maybe not space, maybe you've stood still, actually. I'm just looking at the refugee page right now. They are moving through space, the final frontier. So you come to your group that session and you say, blah blah blah, lots of hills, everything's pretty but also harsh. And by the end of the first week, some things have gone wrong. 2 things, specifically. Each of these 2 things should challenge one of those categories that we mentioned as being important resources for survival. The food, the water, the shelter, the security. In this case, you tell your players that the refugees have noticed, they've come to you and they've said, one of the kids is missing. Wilhelm, he's run off. We can't find him. He must have slipped off into the woods, followed a bunny rabbit or whatever. But also you inform your players that for the last 3 nights they've heard howling echoing across the wilderness, and they know that they're entering wolf territory and they should really begin preparing some kind of a defense against wolves should they decide to attack during the night. And your players have to make a decision because it's not that long before nightfall and they've got to choose one of these 2 things to dedicate their time towards personally. Do they go off, do they try to rescue this child in the woods who's gone missing, or do they try to prevent the potential danger of the wolves, something that threatens the whole of the refugee group that you're escorting? Because you, the DM, have prepared basically 2 fairly simple, straightforward adventures. I would recommend even making them a little bit larger than life. Make them like classic one-shots for your players, and that's gonna fill up the bulk of your session, alright? So that's how we're gonna fill out all this time, is that we're basically skimming over the week as it happens, and then giving your players one kind of huge choice that they have to make, and then letting the rest of the session play out like a normal adventure. They go off and they decide that they will save the child, and so you give them the adventure where the child has been kidnapped by a witch in the forest and you have to go and deal with this witch. Or alternatively, they decide that they've got to handle this wolf situation. They can't waste time on little Wilhelm. And so instead you give your players the adventure where they track the wolves to their cave, their den, and they have to take out the warg that's leading them. Warg. I always say warg because it's like war with a G. I feel weird saying warg. So they've made their choice, they've played out the session, they finish up and they go home. Next time they come to a session, you use the decision that they made last time to build on and say, all right, well, it's week 2. Because you went off and you saved Wilhelm, some people did get injured during the night. No one was killed, but some of the injuries that the refugees got during having to fend off wolves in the night, by now, a week later, they're starting to fester. The people are getting sick. Also, at the same time, during the attack by the wolves, because you hadn't set up any defenses against them, a bunch of the dogs got into the food supplies and a ton of the food has been spoiled, which severely limits the amount that everyone will be able to eat for the rest of the trip. What do they choose? What do they choose? they've got to handle something, they've got to handle it now. And you've prepared so that if they choose to sort the food issue, they have to go hunting to replenish the supplies. Or if they decide they have to handle these sick refugees right away, you set up an adventure where a bunch of traveling merchants come by who happen to have the medicine that you need, but they want a favor in return. What's that adventure gonna be? That you have to bring them the eye of a chimera or something. Again, they go on their adventure, it fills up most of the session. They go home, they come back next week and you say, alright, well you handled that. But because you went after the chimera to get the medicine for the refugees, now people are getting hangry. They're living off tiny little rations every day and they're starting to get real, like, touchy about everything. Maybe you hear whispers that someone is being pushed to the brink and they're planning a murder, but you don't know who's the murderer and you don't know who's the victim. So their adventure, if they chose that, would be a little whodunit. You can mix up the genre for these one-shots. And maybe at the same time the water has gotten low and so you find a well but you have to clear out the booglies living in the cave with the underground whatever in order to actually get access to the clean water. So it should roll on and it should take a couple of weeks, but it shouldn't, it's kind of like an overarching umbrella within which you couch these little sort of zoomed in adventures that go, well, you've been handling all sorts of things, but this is the part that we're going to focus on. This is something that your party is doing now, and that's what you focus on for the session. And then the next week you say, well, this has happened in the past week, but this is what we're focusing on now. They're like little crisis points for anyone who's familiar with the age system, the crisis points in warfare for the age system, kind of this big picture, little picture system that you have set up. I'm not super sure about this next bit, but I kind of wanted to have the idea in there that you have to keep the spirits of the people relatively, like, decent. Not high, but like, you gotta keep them not hating you, because you're in charge and you can be put not in charge. So I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking like they have 3 spirit points, and for every time you ignore the same thing twice in a row, the thing goes down. So like if you ignored the food problem twice in a row, then they would lose a spirit point. And if you ignored it again later on, you lose a spirit point. Not really much of an issue, except on extremely long things that you would do like this. But I don't know, I just want there to be an element of like, if you do ignore little Wilhelms too many times, the people will be like, well, clearly we can't trust you because you hate our children and keep feeding them to witches. And so then they go, you suck and we're not paying you. Or they say, you suck, and they all jump you, and because there's 100 of them, no matter how weak a refugee is, that's a lot of refugees to fight. I mean, less now that you've let so many Wilhelms die. Meanwhile, by the way, on the other side of the thing, if you'd chosen to go and hunt the wolves, perhaps the next week's issue is that it started to rain, just a torrential downpour. The refugees, they weren't prepped with anything more than their ordinary clothes, so they are getting soaked through to the bone. And in the same downpour, you find that a flash flood has washed away the bridge that you were counting on for continuing on your path. And so the next ford is a week out of your way, essentially adding an extra crisis that your party are gonna have to deal with to the end of this sequence. So do they try to find shelter for the refugees now, and you give them an adventure where you have to, I don't know, clear out an abandoned fort so that you can set up and wait out the rain? Or do you try and secure passage across the river in a totally different adventure so that you don't have to risk the refugees for an extra week? If you do decide to secure passage across the river, then the refugees start getting ill. You can use that idea for an adventure hook on the other branch, the one from the wolf attack injuries. Stick it on them being sick because they were stuck in the rain trying to cross this river. Or the same thing, the food got spoiled because they were out in the rain while you were crossing the river. And so now you have to deal with finding more food. The problems should roll on, they should build off each other, they should continue, and it should feel like an ongoing kind of, what choice do we make because these choices matter? Real quick, just covering like little bits of ideas of how it would work for something like flood relief. So the first week, you've got this big problem that you have to deal with on the first week. People are without shelter because their homes have been destroyed. But at the same time, people are without clean drinking water for the first time. And what are we going to do about that? Do you temporarily rehouse the people in the ghost town up the hill that they'd long abandoned? Or do you have a heist session where you go and you commandeer barrels of wine from a nearby wealthy vineyard where you have to avoid the guards and you have to to bring these big barrels and fill them up with water and bring them to the townspeople to keep them supplied. If you didn't deal with the water and you did the ghost town thing, people have been drinking unclean water. Now they're getting sick. You can use the idea, see, you're not going to be doing these huge prolonged things that often in games, so you can kind of reuse some of these basic ideas. People are getting sick, you need to get them clean drinking water, so you have an adventure where you have to defend a shipment of clean drinking water from the next town over. But at the same time, bandits have been taking advantage, scavengers have been taking advantage of the emptied town, and they've been coming in to try to steal stuff from people's homes while they're left unattended. So there's the other option of launching a counter-strike against the temporary bandit encampment. If you stole the barrels of wine from the vineyard, then maybe now the wealthy vineyard owner has recognized, he's suspicious that that's where his property has gone, and so he is harassing the people of the town for a toll, a water toll basically. And you have to fight off waves of his guards. But at the same time, the food that was left in the open because you haven't found adequate shelter yet has begun to rot in all the water. Maybe this time you go hunting in the local area, but it pisses off the local rangers. Suddenly you've got them to contend with. See how it still kind of works, even though it's not like an overland travel kind of situation anymore. You're staying in one place, you're handling this one situation, but because it's prolonged, because you're looking after a group of people, those are the same four things threatened again. It's the food, the water, it's the shelter, and it's the safety. I do think that you could do it with, like, a prolonged siege as well. So, like, you're trying to just keep the people within this keep safe until the king can send his army to wipe out the enemy or something, you know? But in the meantime, the enemy have contaminated the main well that supplies this keep with water. But the people you're defending show you a secret, super risky entrance into the Underdark where you can hopefully find another water source and dig down to create a secondary well. Or, at the same time, the South Gate's been compromised by bad guys with battering rams. You gotta basically pull that thing that Gimli and Aragorn do in Helm's Deep, where they go and they fight off the people, the Uruk-hais, long enough so that they can reinforce the gate. That thing, have that be an adventure, that'd be sick. You gotta work out how to keep supply lines going, you gotta work out how to safely keep exits free, you know, that sort of a thing. So that's what I'm thinking. It is a prototype, but I think it could be a cool thing to have a system of, like, not everything has to be happening, like, right now in the moment. I like that idea of stretching the time out, doing it over multiple sessions, but having those sessions be kind of micro-focused on specific things that are happening during the elongated turmoil. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Thank you to Falconer for getting my brain working again. Hopefully people found some value in this, even if it was just sparking ideas of your own and how you might handle this sort of thing. Apart from that, I do believe that's it. I'm done. Email this to your grandma and I will see you some other time. Turmoil!